The reunion hall smelled like reheated coffee and 28 years of nostalgia nobody had asked for. I almost didn't come. I told myself it was because of the overtime shift I'd have to trade with someone, but the truth was simpler than that. I didn't like remembering who I used to be at 17. The version of me who still believed his life was going to look a certain way. I was standing near the snack table, half listening to a former classmate describe his mortgage, when I felt a hand land on my shoulder. I turned, and it took me a second to place the face under all that gray hair. Mr. Havorson, my old physics teacher, the one who used to stay 40 minutes after the bell just to watch me take apart a broken radio and put it back together correctly. He smiled at me the way teachers smile at students they're proud of, the kind of smile that assumes a particular ending to your story. "So," he said, like we were picking up a conversation from last week instead of 10 years ago, "why didn't you accept the scholarship?" I laughed because for one full second I genuinely thought he had me confused with somebody else. There were 200 kids in our graduating class. People misremember things. "What scholarship?" His smile didn't fade slowly. It just stopped all at once, like someone had hit a switch behind his eyes. He stared at me for what felt like a very long time. Long enough that the noise of the room seemed to pull back from us, the way a tide pulls back right before it does something unkind. "The full scholarship," he said finally. "The one we spent months helping you earn." I didn't say anything. I don't think I was capable of saying anything. Somewhere behind my ribs, something that had been sitting very still for 10 years started to move. To understand why that sentence took the floor out from under me, I have to take you back. Further back than feels comfortable, if I'm honest. I grew up in a house where the television rarely worked and I rarely cared, because there was always something more interesting to take apart. By 8, I'd already disassembled 2-clock radios and a toaster, and reassembled both radios into something that actually worked better than before. My mother used to find screws in places screws had no business being and just sigh, the particular sigh of a woman who'd stopped expecting her son to behave like other children. My father called me the engineer before I knew what the word meant, and I wore it like a name I'd chosen for myself. I was good at school in the specific, narrow way that mattered for the thing I wanted. Math came easy. Physics came easier. By junior year, Mr. Havorson had started keeping me after class not to discipline me, but to hand me problems 3 grade levels ahead, just to watch what I'd do with them. He believed in me in a way that felt almost embarrassing, the way it feels when someone sees more in you than you've quite agreed to see in yourself yet. Senior year, he helped me put together applications for a full academic scholarship to the state engineering program, the kind that covered tuition, housing, books, the works. I remember sitting in his office after school filling out essay questions while he reread my answers and made small, exacting corrections in red pen. It felt like the first time in my life an adult outside my family had decided I was worth the effort. I came home that spring with grades that made my mother put a hand over her mouth and my father, a quiet man who rarely showed pride out loud, actually say the word proud. I thought, foolishly, that the hard part was already over. Then came the family meeting. I remember the kitchen table more clearly than I remember most of what was said at it. My mother's hands folded too tightly in front of her. My father not quite looking at me, the way people don't look at you when they've already decided something and are bracing for how you'll take it. There wasn't enough money, they said. The factory my father worked at had cut hours that year. There were debts I hadn't known about, bills stacking up quietly in the background of a childhood I'd assumed was stable. And my brother, 2 years younger, would need his own path through school eventually, too. The family needed help now, they said. Not someday. Now. I didn't argue. I want you to understand that about me, because it matters later. I was 17, and I loved my parents in the uncomplicated way you love people before life has given you reason to do the math on it. If they said there was no money, there was no money. I folded up the version of my future that involved lecture halls and research labs, and I put it away somewhere I told myself I wouldn't think about again. 2 weeks after graduation, I started at the plastics factory off Route 9, the same one half the men in our neighborhood eventually ended up at, one way or another. 12-hour shifts on the injection molding line, the kind of work that teaches your body to function on autopilot while your mind goes somewhere else entirely. I was good with machines, so I moved up faster than most, eventually into maintenance, then into a supervisor role overseeing the line techs. It wasn't engineering. It was the closest thing to it that the life I'd been handed allowed for. I gave my parents most of my paycheck for years, not grudgingly. I want to be honest about that too, because the bitterness I feel now came later, and it would be dishonest to pretend I felt it then. I covered the mortgage twice when my father's hours got cut again. I paid for my mother's dental work out of pocket because the insurance through the factory didn't cover enough of it. I never once heard the word thank you attached cleanly to any of it, but I didn't need it then. I thought I was doing what a good son did. My brother, Daniel, started college the year I turned 20. I remember driving him to campus myself, helping him carry boxes into a dorm room twice the size of anything I'd ever lived in, feeling something that was almost entirely pride, and only a small, manageable fraction of something else I didn't have a name for yet. My parents were at every parents' weekend. They went to his graduation in matching outfits they'd bought specifically for the occasion. I paid for part of his tuition 2 separate semesters when his work study fell through, transferred straight from my account into his. No conversation needed, because by then helping had simply become the shape of who I was in that family. I built something out of the years that followed anyway. I got certifications on weekends. I read engineering journals on my lunch breaks, alone in my car the way some men read novels. I made supervisor, then plant engineer, the highest a man without a degree could climb at a place like that. I had a decent apartment by 28. I dated on and off, but never seriously, because some part of me kept waiting for a future I couldn't quite name to arrive before I let anyone else build a life alongside mine. People sometimes asked why I wasn't married yet. I never had a good answer. I think the honest one was that I was still, somewhere underneath everything, waiting for permission to want something for myself. Which brings me back to that reunion hall, 10 years later, standing across from a man whose face had just told me something was deeply wrong before his mouth had finished the sentence. "What do you mean, the one we spent months helping me earn?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Mr. Havorson looked for a moment like a man recalculating something he'd assumed was settled. "The state program," he said slowly. "Full tuition, housing, a living stipend even because your application essay about your father's factory work qualified you for the hardship supplement. We mailed the acceptance in June. I called your house twice that summer to ask if you had questions about orientation." He paused. "You never called back. I figured you'd decided to go a different direction. I assumed maybe a better offer came along somewhere." The room had gone strange around me, the way rooms do when your body understands something before your mind has caught up to it. "Nobody told me," I said. "I never saw a letter." He went quiet, watching my face the way you watch someone you're afraid might be standing near a drop you can't see from where you are. "Then I think," he said carefully, "we should find out what happened to it." It took him 2 phone calls and 4 days to track down a former colleague in the records office. The kind of administrative miracle that only happens when a teacher has spent 30 years building a reputation for caring more than he had to. The acceptance letter had been mailed to my home address on June 11th. Certified, signature required. The signature on file belonged to my mother. I sat with that piece of paper in my car, outside the post office, for almost an hour before I could make myself drive home. I want to tell you I confronted them calmly, like a reasonable adult having a reasonable conversation. I didn't. I walked into my parents' kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd told me there was no money 10 years earlier, and I put the records office printout on the table between us without saying anything at all. My mother looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at my father. Then she started to cry, which I have come to understand over the years since is sometimes less an expression of guilt than an attempt to end a conversation before it goes somewhere unbearable. "You knew," I said. "You signed for it." My father was the one who finally spoke, and his voice had none of the steadiness I remembered from that kitchen table meeting a decade earlier. "We were going to lose the house," he said. "Your hours would have covered it. The scholarship would have taken you 4 states away for 4 years, and we needed you here now, not in some future where everything had already fallen apart. You could have told me there was a scholarship and that you needed me to stay anyway," I said. "I would have made my own choice. You took the choice away from me before I ever knew it existed." My mother's voice came out small, almost childlike. "We were scared," she said. "We thought if you saw that letter you'd leave and you'd never forgive us for asking you to stay instead. So instead you made sure I never had the chance to choose," I said. "And you let me believe for 10 years that I'd given up something willingly, that I was a good son for it." I felt something in my chest finally crack open, slow and total, the way ice gives way on a lake you've been walking across for years without knowing how thin it had got. "I wasn't choosing anything. You just decided for me and let me carry it like it was mine." There was a long silence after that, the kind where everyone in the room is waiting to see who speaks next and dreading whoever does. "Daniel knew," my father said finally, quietly, like he was setting down something heavy he'd been holding for a long time. He found out a few years after. We told him not to say anything. We thought it would only hurt you to know. I called my brother that night. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize the way I needed him to either. He said he'd found the old mail receipt by accident in a drawer when he was home for a holiday years back, and he'd asked our parents about it, and they'd asked him to keep it quiet, and he had because, as he put it, "What good would it have done to tell you by then? You already had your life figured out." I didn't have a response for that one either. I think some betrayals are simply too large to argue with in the moment. You just have to sit inside them for a while before you know what you think. I didn't speak to any of them for almost 2 months after that. What pulled me out of it wasn't forgiveness. It was Mr. Havorson calling again, this time with a different kind of news. He'd reached out on his own to a former colleague of his, a professor named Dr. Ake, who now ran an applied mechanical engineering research group at the same state university that had tried to claim me a decade earlier. Havorson had described my factory career, my certifications, the supervisor work, the engineering journals read alone in a parked car on lunch breaks for 10 straight years. Dr. Ake, it turned out, ran a program specifically built for non-traditional students, people who'd built real technical experience outside the usual academic pipeline, and she wanted to meet me. I drove out to the campus on a gray Saturday, half expecting to feel like an imposter the moment I walked into a building full of 22-year-olds. Dr. Ake was nothing like I expected, brisk and direct, with a way of asking questions that made it clear she'd already read my application twice and had opinions about it. "You've effectively been doing field engineering for a decade without the paper to prove it," she said, flipping through a folder with my certifications, and a letter Havorson had written on my behalf. "Most of my graduate students would kill for the practical troubleshooting instincts you picked up on a factory floor. The question isn't whether you belong here. The question is whether you're willing to be a 28-year-old sitting next to 19-year-olds for 2 years while you catch up on the theory." I told her I'd spent 10 years willing to do harder things than that for people who never once said thank you. I think that was the answer she was looking for. The program offered flexible scheduling built around people with jobs and families, research assistantships that came with a small stipend, and a fast-tracked credit transfer for my technical certifications. It wasn't the full 4-year scholarship I'd lost at 17. It was something else. Something I'd be building with both hands this time, with my eyes open, instead of having decided for me in a kitchen I'd trusted. Going back to school in my late 20s was its own particular humility. I sat in calculus lectures next to kids who called me sir without irony. I failed a thermodynamics exam in my first semester and felt something close to despair before reminding myself, in the quiet of my car afterward, that despair was something I'd survived plenty of times before, usually for worse reasons than a bad grade. I studied at night after research shifts, the way I used to read engineering journals on factory lunch breaks. Except now the studying had somewhere to go. My parents asked me, more than once over those years, why I couldn't just let it go. We did what we thought was right. My mother said, late one evening on the phone, her voice carrying the particular weariness of someone hoping a long enough apology might finally be accepted simply because it had been offered. "Because I already gave you 10 years, I told her. "I'm taking the rest back." I didn't say it cruelly. I said it the way you state a fact you finally stopped needing anyone else to agree with. 5 years after that reunion, I finished my advanced degree with a research focus on industrial automation systems, work that drew directly, more than I ever expected, on a decade spent inside the guts of factory machinery most engineers only study from textbooks. A paper I co-authored with Dr. Ake on predictive maintenance systems got picked up by 2 manufacturing firms within a year of publication. I gave my first invited talk at a regional engineering conference the same spring my brother, by then settled into an unremarkable logistics job he rarely mentioned, sent me a brief, careful text wishing me luck. My parents have gotten older in the meantime, the way parents do once the children they shaped have stopped needing their permission for anything. I see them sometimes. Holidays, mostly. The relationship isn't gone, but it isn't what it was either, and I've stopped expecting it to repair itself into something it never actually was in the first place. At the conference last fall, Dr. Ake found me near the back of the exhibit hall, watching a crowd of much younger engineers cluster around a poster session showcasing work that, 10 years earlier, might have been mine to present as a 22-year-old instead of a 32-year-old. "You should have been here 10 years ago," she said, not unkindly, just stating the math of it the way she stated everything. I thought about that for a moment, about a kitchen table, about a certified letter with my mother's signature on it, about 12-hour shifts and engineering journals read alone in a parked car and a brother who knew and said nothing. Maybe, I said. Then, after a pause that didn't feel sad anymore, just honest. But at least I'm here now. My parents stole 10 years of my future. I think they believed, in whatever twisted, frightened logic got them there, that it would keep me close, keep me theirs, keep the family from falling apart the way they'd convinced themselves it would without me. It didn't keep anything. It just delayed who I was always going to become.